Thank you so much. I really do appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conference. Let me start by sharing some inside information about how this talk actually came to be. Tell me how you would react to an invitation from a program organizer that was pitched in this way. And I'm quoting here, more or less. At these meetings, that would be this one, we are mostly scientists who pretty much listen to each other talk, ask a few predictable questions, and then move on to the next topic. We are more or less always on the same page. We want you, that would be me, to tell us something we need to hear. Something provocative, something challenging, something stimulating. Okay, scientist, here's a flash. Unless you have an ego the size of a Daphnia, I'll bet that you would readily accept such an invitation. As I did. Great. That decision was easy. But what should I say? What do you need to hear? What do you want to hear? What would be provocative? What might challenge you? How about the notion that science should play the dominant role in politics? That would be safe and reassuring, at least to us scientists. But you wouldn't believe it. Or perhaps I should focus on the specific, something about the type of information demanded by old-time radio and television dragnet detective Joe Friday. For those of you not old enough to remember my childhood hero, Detective Sergeant Friday, the most famous quote attributed to him was, "Just the facts, ma'am." No political spin, no advocacy, no irrelevant details, just the scientific facts and their probabilities. Simple, straightforward, honorable. The ideal moralized of science that we have all heard about long ago in Biology 101. I'd like this idea, and I did spend time pondering how best to present this noble, this classic vision of the role of scientists in public policy. And I ran some early ideas by one of my more reflective graduate students, someone I knew who would be supportive because he hadn't yet been immersed in the less pure aspects of the scientific enterprise. As only an idealistic and passionate young scientist would say, quoting more or less here, "Dr. Lackey, things have changed since you were a graduate student. You are living in a dream world. Most of the public just assumes we are policy advocates. These days, the only people who really trust scientists are scientists themselves. You need to get real." Is this the breed of scientists our universities are now producing? Scientists who see themselves as members of a policy advocacy group? Is this what scientists have become in the US, in Canada? I would normally dismiss such a judgment, especially one coming from a naive graduate student. But I well remember a scolding I received from a very experienced career government lawyer. And it is not a pleasant recollection, even after all these years. We were relaxing in a pub after spending a long day listening to dueling scientists testifying in an Endangered Species Act trial. I was trying to convince him, a lawyer, from my perspective, a scientist, that it seemed reasonable to expect the opposing sides to at least be able to agree on the basic science relevant to this particular court case, or as Joe Friday would demand, just present the scientific facts. After all, the legal debate should be over interpretations of the law, not the science, right? My argument seemed pretty self-evident to me. In retrospect, perhaps I was badgering him a bit too much, but his response stunned me. And I'm more or less quoting here, "Bob, you guys," by that he meant you scientists, "you guys have no credibility. All of you spin your science to lend a support to whatever policy outcome you or your organization favors. I'm not sure science was ever a beacon of truth, but it sure isn't now, at least not in the legal arena. I watch scientists routinely misuse science in case after case." Okay, that's it. a naive graduate student, and a jaded lawyer on the same page. Time to concede. Perhaps I was suffering from a case of delusional reality. The credibility of scientists is being challenged, and it is being challenged by a broad swath of the public. Pick your favorite current policy issue: changing climate, fluoridation, genetic engineering, endangered species, vaccinations, evolution, the Keystone XL pipeline, fisheries management. Much of the public no longer trusts scientists to just present the facts, as Joe Friday demanded. From my experience in government, academia, and the private sector, suspicions about the motives of scientists have less to do with some grand conspiracy theory than with what scientists have actually said or written, and who pays their salary. For example, remember the ClimateGate email controversy, the leaked or hacked emails written by university and government scientists. Yes, to us scientists, emails were very embarrassing because they exposed the seamier side of how science sometimes is done. More interesting to me, though, is what most of the subsequent discussions in the scientific community was about, reassuring ourselves and the public that the basic science involved was not undermined, and so, oh well, no harm, no foul, no big deal, okay. But think about how these emails played to an already skeptical public. Here's a specific example. In one of those emails, written by a well-known university scientist, a scientist funded by taxpayer dollars, and after his employer had received a formal request to provide copies of certain emails as required by that country's version of the Freedom of Information Act, this scientist actually suggested by email that his collaborators delete any emails dealing with the same subject. Amazing. Asking colleagues to delete emails that have been or likely will be legally requested. What is there to hide? Wouldn't a reasonable person be at least suspicious about the motives? No wonder many people, everyday people, in the real world have come to view scientists collectively as simply one more advocacy group. To those of us who are scientists, to those of us who teach would-be scientists, if we don't like this situation, and I don't, we need to clean up our act. I challenge each of you to look in the mirror and identify things that you might have done to exacerbate this sorry state of affairs. As a first step in restoring the credibility of the overall scientific enterprise, I propose that we jettison 3 assertions that muddle ecological policy. These 3 assertions are widely taken as self-evident truths by a good number of graduate students and by many of my colleagues, perhaps even a few of you. The first scientific assertion that should be jettisoned is science is the key to resolving ecological policy disputes. Yes, this common assertion is wrong. Science is rarely the key to resolving ecological policy disputes. But how often have you heard this lament from scientists? If we just had better science, or at least more science, more data, the best policy choice would be obvious, and we could move on. It is lack of science that is the main obstacle to deciding what to do. This lament is often followed by a proposed course of action. Fund us, and we'll provide you with the necessary scientific information to make for an easy decision. I know. I've followed this script many times in the never-ending search for research funding. Have you? Here's my confession. When I worked as a research scientist at the Environmental Research Protection Agency, part of my job was to convince the EPA regulatory people that their main problem was really a lack of scientific information. You know the marketing pitch. Send money, you'll buy more science, and more science will help you solve your policymaking problem. To prosper these days, a research scientist must play this game and play it well. More money means that you can hire additional staff, buy better equipment, publish more papers, and ascend the scientific pecking order. But the fact is that science rarely drives policy debates, at least not policy debates that people care much about. Let me illustrate with an example of how more science actually muddles a policy debate. It is an example from far away, a case study that you can analyze with detachment and comfort, but one that illustrates what has become ever so typical in ecological policy. Think about my part of the world, the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. For 3 decades, there has been a highly polarized debate over what the primary purpose of the publicly owned forests should be. Simplifying this complex policy debate down to a core question: A, should these public lands be managed for sustained timber production to foster economic development generally, or for rural communities specifically? Or should these public lands be preserved for non-consumptive uses such as recreation and species protection that primarily benefit urbanites? But what have you read about? About the plight of the spotted owl, right? An at-risk species that almost no one, even the most enviros, cared much about prior to its selection as the species of choice to trigger the Endangered Species Act. Even more bizarre, the major political debate over choosing between 2 competing and legitimate public policy goals collapsed into endless court cases revolving around the most esoteric aspects of the life history of this obscure species. No wonder much of the public has become cynical about the political process and the role of science. Some policy advocates, those pushing to stop logging on public lands, admit, at least in private, that selecting the charismatic species was a tactic to invoke the substantial legal powers of the Endangered Species Act. In short, the scientific facts about spotted owls became the legal weapon, a surrogate, used by advocates to achieve their primary goal, to stop logging on public forests. Conversely, other policy advocates, those promoting logging to support rural communities economically and meet domestic demand for lumber and paper, these advocates pitched science in a way that supported their policy goal to allow logging on public forests. Great for policy advocates. They're free to use whatever tactics or tools work in policy debates. But for the credibility of science in the eyes of the public, very costly. If someone could miraculously and instantly learn everything possible about spotted owls, the policy debate would still continue because science has simply become a weapon in the larger policy war. Now let's move to a second scientific assertion that needs to be hauled to the nearest landfill, and the sooner the better. That assertion is natural ecosystems are superior to human-altered ones. Who says that natural ecosystems are superior to human-altered ones? That assumption is so pervasive, it has become so commonplace that some scientists just take it as a self-evident fact. Perhaps even some in this room. Let me illustrate how this assertion actually plays out in a scientific enterprise. From the perspective of a scientist, think about the question of whether or not to dam a river to produce electricity. There's absolutely nothing in science that implies that an undammed river is more or less valuable than the same river dammed to generate electricity. Free-flowing rivers and dammed rivers are different ecologically, most definitely different, but neither is better or worse until a policy preference is invoked, until a value judgment is applied. Applying value judgments, choosing between competing policy preferences, this is beyond the scope of science. But is it common for science to be biased towards unaltered states of ecosystems, towards natural? Most scientists will answer unflinchingly, no way. or perhaps, well, at least not my science. Let me counter with some data. For many years, I have surveyed students who take my graduate level policy class. They complete a survey on the first day of the term. A survey determined inherent policy bias. The result? There is absolutely no question that among these students, at least, all with bachelor's degrees and many with master's degrees in some field of science, there is a strong feeling that natural ecosystems are inherently superior, just somehow better than human-altered ones. Further, most of these students describe unaltered ecosystems as healthy and highly altered ecosystems as degraded. The implied conclusion? A healthy ecosystem is clearly in better shape than a degraded one. And further, human alteration is a bad thing, perhaps necessary for providing food and shelter, but still not really a good thing. Therefore, my conclusion, the term health presupposes that natural is preferred to human altered. But, and we scientists need to remember this, whether society wants a fish community dominated by Chinook salmon and alewives, or one dominated by lake trout and ciscos, these are policy choices. Informed by science, yes, but a policy choice nevertheless. To say an ecosystem is healthy or degraded implies an embedded policy preference, and thus it is not real science. It is normative science. Normative science does have the facade of regular science, but it has an assumed policy preference, a hidden policy preference, a stealthily hidden policy preference. For example, why is it that native species are almost always considered preferable to non-native species? Nothing in science says that one species is inherently better than another, that one species is inherently preferred, or that one species should be protected and another eradicated. To illustrate, why do most people lament the sorry state of the honeybee in North America, a non-native species that has outcompeted native bee species? Yes, honeybees are non-native, what many people would label as an invasive species, but people value their ecological role. Conversely, zebra mussels, another common but non-native species, are nearly universally regarded as a scourge. Where are the advocates for this species? Even with increased water clarity, no cheerleaders. Or what about North American feral horses, wild horses, mustangs, another non-native species, but one that enjoys an exalted status by many? Would you want to be the land manager tasked with culling this ever-expanding population of this invasive non-native species? Values drive these categorizations, not science. The third scientific assertion needs to be tossed in the rubbish bin is the values, that is, the policy preferences of scientists are special. Let me say that again. The values, that is, the policy preferences of scientists are special. They are not. Yes, science is one of several types of information, and it can and should be valuable in policymaking, at least in my opinion. But clashing values, clashing policy preferences in the jargon of political scientists, these are typically at the core of policy debates. And the policy preferences of scientists are no more important than those of non-scientists. To lose sight of this fact is to undermine the credibility of one thing that we scientists can uniquely contribute to policy debates, providing policy-neutral science that allows others to focus on debates over which values and which preferences will win out. When scientists step outside the bounds of science, our only area of special expertise, we should remember the admonition of Richard Feynman, sometimes described as a scientist Scientist, quoting, I believe that a scientist looking at non-scientific problems, and policy making is certainly one, is just as dumb as the next guy. And there is a real price to pay when scientists slip into policy advocacy and overtly or covertly push policy preferences. For example, think about the unrelenting policy debate over what should be done or can be done about a warming climate. Nearly everyone is aware that climate changes over centuries and millennia. Changing climate is the norm, not an aberration. People know this intuitively. For example, there is little question that today's temperatures are higher than they were 150 years ago. After all, the planet 150 years ago was emerging from the Little Ice Age, a relatively cool period from around 1400 to 1800. And before the Little Ice Age was the medieval warm period from around 900 to 1300. Old news for sure. But the policy relevant scientific debate is over how much of the current warming is due to human actions. This is where the political dynamics of a scientific debate get interesting. It is ever so easy for us technocrats, for scientists, to take comfort in the view that if only they understood the science, they would appreciate the seriousness of the political debate. We scientists need to explain it again, but with simpler words this time. But which scientists to trust? Presumably, the public can trust scientists employed by government agencies and ministries, right? At least their policy preferences should not color their science, right? Before you so quickly place government scientists among the angels, imagine that you are the ordinary Joe or Jane citizen trying to figure out which scientists to trust about the degree to which humans have caused the observed warming. Okay, tell me what you, the average citizen, would think when you hear the following statement from a senior government officials who have influence over which government research programs and which government scientists get funded. This is one of those times when holding dual citizenship helps. For you Americans, consider this statement from a senior official in the Department of State. Quoting here, we've got to ride the global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we will be doing the right things in terms of economic policy and environmental policy. But for you Canadians out there, I'm also one of you, and we should not be entirely complacent. Imagine that you are the average member of the Canadian general public and you hear the following statement from the Minister of the Environment, quote, no matter if the science is all phony, there are collateral environmental benefits. Climate change provides the greatest chance to bring about justice and equality in the world. What conclusions would the public draw from the policy neutrality of science funded by government when they hear these kinds of statements from senior leaders? Wouldn't the average person be at least somewhat suspicious about the impartiality of scientists working for these organizations? Okay, another confession. My naive grad student was right after all. At least for many people, scientists are perceived as just one more policy advocacy group. Even more disconcerting, I understand why. Let me wrap up with a quote attributed to the late New York Senator Daniel Moynihan, quoting here, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but he is not entitled to his own set of facts. And facts, including probabilities, are what the public and decision makers need from scientists, not pushing our personal opinions about what policy option should be chosen, nor stealthily advocating in favor of our employers' policy preferences by slipping into normative science. One thing that scientists must bring to the political dynamic is a blunt recognition that nothing in policy making is free. This contribution, this reality check, is often not welcome. In fact, Scientists who push this reality too forcefully are often ostracized. But there are ecological, economic, and societal consequences associated with all policy options. Policy win-win only exists in the sham arguments pitched by election year political campaigns. Every policy choice involves winners and losers. There are no free lunches. An inconvenient truth for sure. To policymakers, I say, science is important in helping you understand the likely consequences of each policy choice. But it is only one of many inputs. Choosing among competing values and priorities is what you do. Don't use science and scientists to evade this difficult, often unpleasant, and frequently contentious responsibility. And finally, to scientists I say, be fully engaged, but stick to the science. Tell the truth, tell the whole truth. It may be uncomfortable, it may be unpleasant, it may be unappreciated, but scientists should strive to be unimpeachable providers of facts and probabilities. Nothing more, nothing less.